Hi, I'm Clara De Lima, a marketing professional who researches the intersection of health trends and marketing strategies. There's been a noticeable rise in consumer goods, especially within the wellness space, using scientific language to appeal to consumers who are looking for trustworthy and effective products. Whether it's skincare, supplements, or light therapy devices, marketers are conveying benefits with technical phrases like molecular repair, biotech engineering, and branding around specific ingredients like hyaluronic acids, peptides, or omega fatty acids. This is a big shift from traditional consumer goods marketing, which has avoided overly technical language to avoid confusing consumers. Even though well intentioned marketers like me work hard to share the science behind their products, it can still be tricky to sort through the details of scientific claims and understand efficacy from product packaging. So, today I'm thrilled to speak with Lesley Northrop, who is the Chief Diagnostic Officer at Everly Health, where she leads advancements in at home diagnostic testing. She was formerly the Chief Scientific Officer at Aspira Women's Health, where she integrated data science and machine learning to improve health outcomes. With over 2 decades of experience in translational science, reproductive technology, and neuroendocrine research, she's been instrumental in developing innovative diagnostic tools that have transformed healthcare. She holds a PhD in neuroendocrinology, reproduction, and genetics from Boston University and has completed a fellowship in molecular genetics and cytogenetics at Columbia University. So, Lesley, from a scientist perspective, what kind of factors make it challenging to definitively demonstrate effectiveness to consumers looking for science backed wellness products?
Well, first off, thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk to you. Yeah, I think, for somebody like me who understands the nomenclature and can kind of weed out the truth from the false, it's really easy for me to do. But for everyday individuals who don't understand the language at times, I think it can become a little bit overwhelming, or just because someone uses fancy words, it must be true. So I think what's really important is for you as a consumer when you're looking for a product is to see if they have any sort of certifications, in the area of subspecialty that they're selling the product in. Are they backed by a clinical organization for that product subspecialty? And then see if they do any sort of clinical studies or user studies on the product and how it changes clinical care or clinical outcomes.
Okay, awesome. Something I've been really curious about is if it's more difficult to understand results when they're gradual or over the long term. I see this a lot in skincare or hair care products where, if you use it for 6 months, then you notice a difference. There's any psychological phenomenon at play that might make it tough to notice small changes over a long period of time that might kind of like cloud our understanding of if something is working.
Yeah, I think too, we lose interest, right, as a society because we have become such a fast paced, quick reward society. And 6 months seems like an eternity for us. Why do I want to wait 6 months for anything to change? But I think if that is backed by the science behind the product, then that's when they start to noticeably see change. Unfortunately, then you need to be patient with the process and you have to follow through with it. I think it's important to, in some of these instances myself, like especially with skincare, I'm always identifying new lotions or new products. Oh my God, I'm so like known for that. My husband always makes fun of me. He's like, you have practically a pharmacy in our bathroom. But I always check in with my dermatologist too to get her opinions and see if is this for real? Because if it is, I will be very, methodical and malicious on using this product as if they're, how they say to use it to make sure that I get the same success that others have gotten. Because not
Yeah,
everything
that's
happens overnight, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a good idea also to check in with the derm and see kind of what professionals think. I think that's always a great idea. Like when in doubt, turn to kind of a trustworthy individual who has a lot of training and education in that field.
Yeah, and they might
Um,
even offer up another product similar that could be quicker. with the same results. You never know.
Totally. That kind of brings up an interesting point. You probably felt this as well, but the COVID-19 pandemic definitely increased consumer interest in health claims. But at the same time, it also increased a lot of skepticism about science in general. How would you say scientists like you and marketers like me can collaborate to provide trustworthy science information about health products?
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting time for us, especially as molecular scientists, when everyone was using PCR like it was, a standard language that they've used their entire life. They probably don't understand what it does, but they do know that if they had a test that uses PCR, it's most effective in diagnosing, right? COVID infection. And that is definitely a challenge too I have internally, and I'm sure you have as well, is that I find that a lot of corporations, if the marketing and the science or the marketing and the clinical teams are not in lockstep with each other, making sure that they're translating effectively. I mean, obviously, some terminology in clinical science you cannot change, right? Like that's the word, like DNA. You cannot make up another saying for what DNA is. But marketers, I've worked with some really amazing marketers over the years where they can find a way to dial it down so it's comfortable and understanding for everybody. So, because knowledge is power, and the more that we can understand about what's out there to get provide us with better healthcare and long-term better health, the better we are as an institution. So I really ask all those scientists out there and marketeers that work together to come together and make sure that you're really, explaining the products in a way that make people feel comfortable, and they really understand it. The last thing any of us want to feel is if we're stupid and we don't understand anything. So I think it starts with us, the experts, and never overpromising on anything because eventually that's going to come back, right? Like be really honest about what the limitations of your product, the benefits of the product, and what it should be used for. And never overpromise on, anything other than that.
Yeah, that's a really good point about kind of meeting in the middle and making sure that we're not over promising. Because yeah, I agree. It does. You do lose trust over the time, and it's kind of like a short term greedy perspective. And
Right.
also really interesting point that you bring up from a scientist perspective, like people, using phrase like PCR, and maybe you don't fully know what it means, but sometimes the scientific language, like in certain instances, really does have to kind of prevail and come through. Um,
Absolutely.
So, something else I wanted to ask about, kind of in the tangent of clinical studies, a lot of small companies don't have the resources for really large clinical studies. They're expensive, they're time consuming. And I would love to know your thoughts on how consumers should evaluate products, especially maybe, if they're from a smaller company that hasn't had extensive testing behind their products.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's hard because we have a really rigorous, I would say, regulatory oversight here to ensure that the products that are out there are safe and effective, right? For yourself and others. Depending on what the product is, I mean, if it's just a basic wellness product like a supplement or something like that, obviously those things are backed by nutritionist brands or backed by other scientific organizations. So it's important, like I said, to make sure that they have some sort of certification, a certified body that oversees these products, and read up on that certified body, to make sure that it's something that you trust. A lot of times, I've been in a lot of startups where we have to do these very thorough, very expensive clinical studies, but these are more highly complex, high risk based tests like diagnosing cancer per se. But I think there's ways that you can be a little bit more creative in a sense of where you can do these smaller studies where you can get volunteers, obviously through, as we say, an IRB approved study design. But you can get volunteers who are willing to provide a sample or feedback or fill out a survey on the use of the product or any other information around it that they've utilized it in their environment that become very powerful to be able to collect that type of data. So then you can better understand just from a survey perspective. I think utility is everything. Obviously, the validity of your products are very important, but taken from that, does it actually do what you say it's going to do? So I think having small studies like that in groups where you can get people to volunteer and fill out surveys for you is really powerful. I find too a lot now with social media, there's a lot of influencers out there that actually utilize these products on their own, right? And they're advertising it and marketing it. So I think it's good for companies to somehow build a rapport, a relationship with that individual, but in a way to not sway them. You know, you want them to give their personal experience and opinion around the product versus, you know, them being paid to give what you want them to say. So I think it's really important to understand who is out there using your products and for others to Google, like see if there's other, I can't believe that's like a term now in our dictionary, right? To look up and see if they can find other people who speak about the product and have used it and speak really highly of it. That is data in itself, even if it's not published in an article.
That's a really interesting point that you bring up about kind of scientists even valuing reviews on social media as a data point. I also like that you bring up kind of, using surveys or working with what you have available as a small
Yeah.
company and kind of looking out for certifications that could be associated with something is kind of a good sign. Um, and you bring up social media. More people are kind of looking to social media for reviews to understand efficacy. Is this something that's going to work for me? How would you say scientists in general are navigating this shift of where consumers go to look for information? Because I've also heard at the same time, more people look at reviews on social media before buying something. At the same time, fewer and fewer people have primary care physicians. So the kind of like where people look for information is shifting a lot over time.
Yeah, this has been a new one for me, especially being a clinical scientist that, the traditional way of how we do things and where I come from is publish or perish, right? You need to publish your research, you need to get out there and get it in a peer-reviewed journal, which I still feel it's exceptionally important, of course. But the consumers don't really understand that and they don't really look for that. So, are there other ways that you can do that? Maybe you present at small conferences, that are organizations that are specialized in whatever your product is under, right? Then that way, that's still a peer reviewed sort of audience that's assessing your products and if there is any science behind it. So I think it's important to sort of look for those types of material for people. So that's really what I try to do when I say if I see something that interests me, Instagram pops up and it knows what I like. I try to research around the company, see if they've presented anywhere. I also look at their advisory board. What type of people do they have on their advisory board or they have on their board or executive leaders? What are their backgrounds and where do they come from? To better understand sort of the approach of what goes into the products that they're developing because that says a lot, without having sort of those published studies readily avail- available to you. But you do have to be careful with social media with everything, right? As we know, there's a lot of improper information that is put out there, and you just have to be your own resource, unfortunately, at times to really do the diligence to see if that information is actually true.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about due diligence and looking at the board, like the advisory board and who's helping make these things and kind of assessing their credentials. And you bring up, peer reviewed studies is kind of like the gold standard. These clinical studies or peer reviewed studies might only have a small group of people in their data set that they're testing, or the study might be set up in a specific way that's not really representative of how an average person would interact with the product. Um, how much would you say those things could kind of impact how we might think about the results of those studies?
I think it's a huge impact. I think unfortunately a lot of us are not aware of this, especially in women's health, right? Only a small percentage of women have ever been included in studies for more than half of the vaccines, drugs, diagnostic tests that we have out there, just in general. Not even just women, but as we know, different racial disparities, right? And that's a real problem that we have today. And I know a lot of us in the clinical scientific community are trying to solve for that. We can't take everything as a silver bullet and think it works for one sex one race, because that's not how it works. We know from genomics we all respond differently. Like, think about it in pharmacogenomics, that's a huge space right now. How we metabolize things. Like, I know I'm a slow metabolizer for pain meds. So my doctor has to give me a lower dose. I have severe reactions to it. So unfortunately, we're all our own little precision-based health experiments in some of these scenarios because we don't have the access or the ability to get the data that we would like that meets our own personal race and ethnicity as well as sex. So I think that's a hard one. If I found a product that I felt that, here's a primary example, COVID test came out for newborns. I did the research, I read the article, and the study size was so small that I decided not to have my children have their first vaccine until they were 5 years of age because of that. So, like, there's certain things like that you can identify, like, okay, well, maybe it's not ready for me or ready for the individual, and just keep an eye on it and watch it and wait for when it is ready for you personally.
That's a really interesting point about, not only the data size that's being tested, but also maybe what kind of access the clinicians, you know, had to different kinds of people, different genders, and they were kind of doing this testing. Those are two interesting things that you bring up. Or anything else that we should look out for that might impact data or outcomes? I've heard, for example, like funding sources might be a tip off that it could potentially be not the most reliable information. Is there anything else that you look out for as a scientist in clinical studies that say, like, maybe this needs a second look?
Yeah, obviously the most important thing is to make sure it was a consented study by
Consent.
an internal review board. So the people, they should say that in their study that the individuals were consented for research. So then that way you know that it was done in a safe and effective way. Yeah, financial backing is interesting. You may see, depending on where the funding is coming from, they may have other interests at heart. But you just want to make sure that it's an unbiased approach to the study design. Like right now, the ARPA H grants is a big thing that's being announced and coming out for a lot of the women's health based tests. That's a really reputable institution. It's from the National Institutes of Health. So you can feel confident that the study designs that went through that rigorous program were viewed by a wide range of individuals and well trained individuals who approached it from all different walks of life. So you can feel that these studies are going to be conducted in a way that's not biased towards one population versus another. So I think seeing what types of grants are supporting these studies, making sure that they're under these IRB approved studies so that people are actually consented safely and effectively, and also make sure
Mhm.
that there isn't any financial incentives, right? You wanted, because people should not be being paid a large sums of money for you to get research data from them.
That's a good point. I think some of the industries where you it's really common is like in the food industry, especially if you ever see a study that's saying like processed food is good for you is the outcome. I think a lot of times there's like some funding incentives that aren't really aligned for consumers' best interests there.
That brings up a value point. One thing is, for instance, if an industry is selling, if the company is selling the product and they have publications and only the people that work for the company are on the paper, it's probably biased. You really want to have external parties like external clinicians and scientists who are part of the study design that are outside of the company walls to make sure that it's a legitimate study.
That's a good point. And this conversation we're having right now, I feel like, is assuming that somebody's going the extra mile and like doing research into the company, doing the due diligence, reading the study. I think a lot of times most people just don't have time for that, unfortunately. I'm wondering if there's any kind of tip offs that we might even see from the product packaging that could indicate, is this something that has rigorous science behind it, or is maybe something that a marketing team has had a heavy hand with editing and
Yes.
kind of not super science backed?
You know how a lot of times on our products on the logos, you're going to have some sort of, it may say it's FDA approved,
Yeah.
right? On there, it may say backed by the dermatology organization or a dental organization, stuff like that on the bottle. I think is really important. I also look for not tested in animals. That's a big thing that's important to me. So I know that it's gone through a more rigorous, validation process. I also look for if they say there's no like paraffins or phthalates or other type of chemicals in the product, that to me means that they developed something that's safe and effective, right? So sometimes they also advertise for different races, like this is backed by women of color, or has only been tested and used in women of color or of other different races, stuff like that. So seeing those types of, I think, sort of stamps or emblems on the product box itself is incredibly important. Understanding, in my space, we like to say the intended use. Okay. That's what the product or the test was validated for. It's just a simple statement. Understanding what that is, and they should have it on the box somewhere or in an advertisement or in their website. You should clearly understand that, because then you know what the product's limitations are, and understand how you fit into those limitations or not, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that is good. I also look out for the not tested on animals. I think you bring up an interesting point about, efficacy being one value, but there's also a lot of other values that go into a person buying a product or how they choose a brand that they like. I think,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was pregnant with both my kids, I actually went on, and there's different grades. It's through alphabet grades of
Mhm.
safety of products or chemicals that are used in products. And so I really made sure when I was pregnant that I was buying brands that had the highest safety, because I knew whatever I put on my skin, whatever I
Mhm.
ingest is going to go to the baby, right? So there are platforms and tools that you can find to research in that way if those are things of interest to you. So like Burt's Bees, right, is one of the most popular organic brands. Because of that, they have such a high safety score. They don't use a lot of chemicals in their products. I'm not, and by the way, I'm not advertising for them. I'm just saying that as an example.
That's good. I mean,
Or
but
I'm
it's
just,
effective though. That made like that kind of word of mouth. I'm like, oh, now I should reconsider Burt's Bees. You mentioned there's a few different platforms where maybe you can spot check ingredients or different brands. Are there any that you like to use as a consumer yourself?
I don't, you can see, like, say if you're at your clinician's office or your clinician wants to offer you a test, you can go on like the FDA website and see if those tests are cleared or not. You can
Yeah.
search for these things, right? So if you want to confirm, like, there's a lot of over the counter tests now and stuff like that. But you can also look, a lot of times just by searching on the internet, you can usually find websites that are backed by the clinical organizations, for that subspecialty, determine whether or not it's something that you should utilize.
Something else that I'm curious about. I know placebo effect is something that's really big that can kind of change how we think about if a product is working or not. Um, how big of a role would you say that plays in understanding efficacy, especially something like supplements, where it's not like you really see a visual difference like you might see with a hair care product? I think supplements is like a really big thing where we might notice placebo. I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You hear amazing stories about it at a time where people truly feel, right, like they had a difference and there was nothing, like they were given water instead of the actual drug. I think the mind body connection is a pretty powerful tool. And a lot of times we have found that it's actually, if you just could mentally put yourself in that space, you're actually already curing yourself. Like you hear about all the time with cancer, people who are diagnosed with cancer, changing their diets, positive thinking, right? Always have positive thinking. Really, that's like a placebo effect, right? It really changes your perspective. Another area that I've seen it work is in back pain. A lot of, usually people, clinicians or other doctors may say, "Oh, you should have surgery for this." Well, back surgery is a really invasive, endpoint for you. And I've seen it go both ways. I've sort of seen it go horribly bad, or I've seen it work. It's helped, right? It's mitigated the pain over time. But I've also seen effectiveness in how the mind body, like if you do mental stability training to rewire your thinking of not thinking about that pain point,
Mhm.
and you're thinking about other things, that's like similar to a placebo effect, right? So if you can control that, I think it's a pretty powerful tool. But I think it's important. It's one of those things that's been around for a long time, right? In drug development, so you have your control group and your case, and it's really hard to get a good control group. That's like one of the hardest things I think in
Really?
most scientific experience, just because how it's there. We have so many different variables, right, around us, and we're not all the same. So even if, say, the person wasn't diagnosed with that disease right then and then, who's to say they're not going to get it in 5 years? So, it's really hard to have groups like that, but I think it's important to understand. I mean, the placebo effect, I think, is more also just like that is like a true negative control, right? Like in a sense that you're not giving them anything and wouldn't see any effect on it. But if you see some mental, I think, positive changes, that goes to show you that I think is another additional powerful tool that could come with the drug at the same time.
Totally. I mean, it's interesting that you bring up, even if a product isn't 100% effective, there might even be some value in just the placebo effect of trying out something new. And that's something I think about as a marketer, even as a consumer. If I'm trying this, but I really believe it's going to work, it might actually work for me. And I don't know if that's entirely harmful. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think positive thinking is an important way to be. And maybe you just feel positive about it because you're doing something better for yourself. You're
totally.
taking care of yourself. So that in itself is a win. Now, eventually over time, you're probably going to see that it doesn't work anymore. And then you figure out, well, maybe it's just my mental positivity that's actually the best thing for me. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the last big questions I had for you was about how you think AI might transform testing and efficacy demonstrations. I've heard, everybody thinks it's going to transform every single industry that exists, and healthcare has definitely been a really big one in wellness products. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how you think AI is going to cause some changes in the industry, or maybe not. Who knows?
Yeah, I think, it's funny. I can't get over how much it's out there. I mean, AI in some stands has been around in healthcare for quite a while. It started with like machine learning, data science, that's early stages, right? The limitation I see is that the AI is only takes information off of what we input it to, right? The data that we calculate, the
Right.
resources of data, the clinical studies that we do, and which is one of the we just talked about. It's one of the most expensive, time consuming things, right? So it's really important in order for the AI to stay relevant in developing, say, tasks, we have to constantly put new data in. We also have to make sure that it's diverse data. I have seen where it overfits or learns on itself because it's not getting enough dynamic data inputs. And so then that's when sometimes, you're over classifying, or maybe you're saying your test is better than it really is. So there's a lot of checks and balances in place for that through our quality control checks as well as through our regulation systems. There's a lot of studies that we have to do to ensure that those things don't happen and don't occur.
Mhm.
But I'm really excited about it because I think it's going to open up more opportunities. More people are going to be trained in that line of thinking. And maybe it will allow us to identify drug target, which we're already seeing. I think
Mhm.
I read somewhere some company posted, don't quote me on it, but something like an increase in 60 or 70% productivity in identifying drug targets by using AI. Now, the problem is now what do we do with it, right? Like we can produce all this data, but then doing the studies and getting it through to a true clinical product, that's where the slows
Yeah.
down a little bit because of money. You need humans, capital, et cetera, to do the studies. So I think it's though, there's a lot of AI out there, as we know. We now have it all in Google Gemini, Meta, like it's everywhere. So I just say, make sure you do some cross checks to make sure that the information is pulled is accurate. Because think about it, they're only pulling what they have available to them.
Totally. You bring up a lot of really good points there, especially about, data in impacts data out. So
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier some of the the gender disparities and racial disparities in terms of the people studied in the clinical trials, and our models are kind of being built on that. So that's a really good thing to look out for. And also, you bring up another good point about the part that happens after, which is actually getting the drug to market that requires humans right now, and that's the slow part. So I feel like those are two important considerations that you brought up. And just to close out, I kind of always like to get an idea of where we think the industry is going from here. And I'd love to know, do you think science and the health and wellness industry are getting closer to working together? Or do you feel that there's kind of a big gap still that needs to be filled?
I think the pandemic was a great way for us to all come together and work for a common cause. Obviously, there's always people who break the rules, unfortunately, in scenarios like that. But I think overall, it was eye-opening for me to watch, especially somebody who works in laboratory science, works with regulators. We only have access to what can be provided to us by our government agencies. And so it really opened up the communication and the collaboration across the industry, as well as the manufacturers. I mean, a lot of us were scrambling just to get supplies in our labs. So we're all having to scramble, come together, support one another, because what happened is everything got prioritized to COVID testing, and all the other testing got put to the wayside. So people weren't getting like regular testing done. And labs that weren't doing COVID testing and were doing regular testing um, had to scramble to find supplies to be able to run tests, screens for breast cancer or colorectal cancer, stuff like that. Like we still have to go on with our overall health and our lives. But then, unfortunately, I find that we are creatures of habit. We are human, and we fall back on what we're most comfortable with. And so, a lot of us have kind of fallen back into our little zones, into our domains. This is mine, and the collaboration has ceased a little bit. But I think we're still trying to push forward as scientists working together in a lot of different organizations, like in genomics started several years ago, where we share data every time we identify a variant in an individual. It's on a public database. So others of us who are running the same test can go on there and be like, okay, this was identified in somebody else. Was it associated with disease or not? So, we can come together more quickly and identify targets that are associated with diseases and conditions. So there's more of that, that comes out, especially also with the pandemic. I find a lot of scientists were collaborating on tracking pathogens, across the US. There's a lot of companies I know of, they've actually built, or globally, across the country, across the world. So I think it definitely opened up more opportunity now that we have more ways of collaborating and not having to fly, to work together. Zoom, Google Meets, whatever video platform you're using is a really powerful tool for scientists to work together on things. So
That's really interesting to kind of think about how disruptive COVID was in so many different ways and the impact that it had on the health industry. But yeah, it does seem like there's an overall tone of optimism, which I have too. I think like everybody's gotten more comfortable talking about health related things and showing more interest. That's always good when consumers are more interested in health and also more interested in kind of looking for more information behind things. Um,
yeah.
Thank you again, Lesley. This was so helpful to kind of unpack things that I'm curious about that I see on my health and wellness products and understand a little bit more about the science behind these things and factors that influence them that I hadn't even considered before. So, thank you again for your expertise and insight.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for inviting me.